on behalf of the Natural Resources Forum and our hosts, Simmons and Simmons, and all our event and panel sponsors, we welcome you to day one of ESG Week. For those of you who I have not yet met, my name is Amon Chandel, and I am Head of Relationship Management at the Natural Resources Forum. You may also know me as a volunteer with Women in Mining. I am just going to run through a few housekeeping points before we begin. You will see your cameras and your mics have been turned off as we are following a traditional webinar panel discussion format. Please direct all your questions via the Q&A button. And we are recording today's webinar, so please check back on our website for the playback link. To all our panelists, please note we are not observing Chatham House rule. So to start us off, I would like to introduce you to Jane Jochen, Corporate Consultant at SRK Consulting, who will be moderating our second panel discussion of the day on ESG solutions. Jane has 28 years experience providing environmental, social, and governance consulting services to the mining industry. Thank you for joining us, Jane, and now I'd like to hand over to you.
Thank you, Eamon. Hello, everybody. Today we've got 5 presenters who are going to tell us about ESG solutions for mining industry and mining industry stakeholders. They're information sharing tools for stakeholders. They address responsible sourcing and responsible finance initiatives which put enormous pressure on the mining industry for disclosure of information to investors and manufacturers. Investors and manufacturers are hungry for information at an asset level, granular information at an asset level, specific information on products. So the first 2 presenters are going to tell us about initiatives that are useful to investors. The first is John van Eegen, and he's going to tell us about Reality Check Systems virtual site visit tool. I'll hand over to John.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you everybody for your time today. My name's John van Eegen, and I'm the founder and CEO of Reality Check. We've built out the tools and cloud infrastructure to facilitate data-augmented virtual site visits to your mines, wherever they happen to be in the world. I'm now going to play you a 30-second video so that you can see a bit of what our solution looks like. Please play the video. So as you've seen, we combine satellite images, maps, 3D models, drone data, 360-degree video and photo, and augment the interactive experience with additional relevant data to provide a deeply insightful virtual site visit. We're helping the industry build trust with all their stakeholders through transparency by leveraging material that, for the most part, they're already collecting through their core operations and repurposing or recycling it into this transparency and stakeholder engagement tool. Satellite images and maps showcasing important features such as settlements, water courses, ground contours and infrastructure, 3D models from mine planning software, geological models, drone and LiDAR surveys of pit walls, stockpiles and tailings dams, data from existing on-site processes, equipment and sensors, and locally gathered 360-degree videos and photos. We can do all this without having to send any personnel to site. Next slide, please. We aim to support a number of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, both directly and indirectly. while we can provide turnkey, start-to-finish virtual tour solutions, we strongly encourage our clients to plan and gather the data assets they need locally to site. We provide the training resources to support the use of existing on-site staff or to quickly upskill existing local service providers. This approach directly promotes partnerships, economic development, and social inclusion, as well as contributing to responsible operations, energy, and the environment by reducing the carbon footprint of a site tour to near zero, as well as reducing the risk of COVID and other potential harms from having non-core personnel on site to near zero. Indirectly, by helping the industry build trust through greater transparency, we hope to enhance the chances of the permitting and funding of ambitious new projects, as well as helping to build the support and social license required from the local communities impacted by such developments. The ability to quickly and efficiently share the site-specific insights and situational intelligence our platform allows helps the asset owner to cast the net wider in terms of finding the right partners, local, national, and international, with the best innovative solutions to deliver the best results for all stakeholders. Next slide, please. We built Reality Check for you so we can be part of your solution and so you can show your stakeholders what a responsible mining operation looks like. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, John. I had introduced your this virtual site visit system as being for investors, but I noted in your presentation you did highlight that it can be used for many other stakeholders, and you highlighted for regulatory authorities, for example, in permitting processes and local communities.
That's absolutely right. We think the value is very far-reaching. We take the stance that the more transparent the industry can be, the better it is for everybody, because transparency promotes confidence and helps, in general terms, get the best, most fair valuation on work that's being conducted. And it's not just financial investors that are evaluating you, of course. It is local stakeholders and community. It is the governments of the host countries where your projects happen to be. So being a good actor and being on the front foot in showcasing that you are a good actor has got to be a good thing. And we've created the tools and the cloud infrastructure to make it as easy and as cost effective and as low risk as possible for mining companies to do that. And we hope that the industry embraces these tools.
Great, thanks. I've got lots of other questions, but I think I must give Jamie Strauss a turn now to tell us about the Digby initiative, which is a platform supporting mining companies to deliver information to investors. Again, it could be to other stakeholders as well. And I understand from Jamie that this is particularly targeted at junior mining companies and possibly mid-tiers. We'll have to fill you in on that.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, morning or afternoon, everyone. So ESG is the single greatest gift to the mining industry in at least a generation. If we embrace it with both arms, then it gives the industry a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of positively changing its perception, capturing hearts and minds of society, and opening huge new pools of capital. But to do so, we need to find the resources to act from within. The mining industry carries a huge weight of responsibility on its shoulder. Its position at the head of the supply chain, its environmental footprint, and its impact on a social scale. We need to acknowledge this and ensure we mitigate the risks at the earliest possible opportunity. I know that the majority of men and women employed or connected to our industry want to see real change, and I commend this conference to allow real discussion on the solutions rather than the rhetoric. My fellow panelists each helped deliver this ambition, and I look forward to working with them in the future. But ESG globally is in a state of confusion. In the mining industry, there are over 35 initiatives alone. What's worse, not one is appropriate for 85% of the industry, the 2,000 plus publicly listed juniors as well as countless privates. Capital providers and the M&A process now require ESG commitments to be made before any significant investment. This will rapidly expand over coming months and years to all public financings, yet these juniors are without resource or experience to address this. In order to help and guide the juniors disclose and build on their ESG commitments, in order to remove the inefficiency that is building up and promulgated between these companies and their financing partners, and in order to improve disclosure and transparency that will encourage M&A, we need a right-sized, future-looking, standardized structure that is supported by all stakeholders. So combining the power of Digby's existing database, along with collaboration in the ESG world, we will launch later this year a set of right-sized frameworks that have been developed by our partner Satala, which is a leading mining risk management and ESG group. It will include a pre- and post-pre-feasibility study status framework, as well as one for producers next year, supported by leading private equity, fund managers, producers, and others. Having mapped over 30 initiatives to ensure current best practice, we listened to juniors and these other groups, the result being an impact-orientated, practical, and real risk-based assessment. Questions split between corporate and project are accompanied with clear rationale as to why the question is being asked and thus providing positive guidance. Each question can support uploaded evidence and narrative before the submission is made through the Digby platform by a board-approved person. Scoring is completed by independent industry professionals, is based on the background context of a project, and therefore shows risks that can be controlled and those that are inherent in the project, providing clear comparison between relevant projects and the companies. This solution gives corporates the ability to disclose their ESG metrics and manage their project risks, costing a typical pre-PFS company around $20,000 for an annual submission, and can typically be completed by either a CEO or VP of exploration. ESG is a journey. Direction of travel is much more important than a single score, so a company can elect to hide its inaugural submission or the submission score for 13 months in order to provide a second submission and thus show a track record. In short, Digby's solution brings the industry together, eclipses many other industries, removes confusion and inefficiency, supports engagement internally and externally, provides a resource to simplify an increasingly critical obligation. Together, we can use ESG as a medium for good on the ground, in the boardroom, and for the industry perception as a whole. Thanks, Jane.
Jamie, I was wanting to ask you just how do mining companies actually come to you and get their data put onto this platform? It's a very simple question, but I'm just...
It's a very simple question. It's a very simple answer. So when we launch we'll have a landing page at the end of this week for anybody to, for the frequently asked questions. But to answer your question, it should be in December of this year we will launch. They will be able to sign on to Digby for free. And then they can immediately get the frameworks, which will be supplied to them depending on the materiality questions that are asked. And then they will be able to answer the question online and upload all the relevant data, perhaps using some of the data from the groups also in this panel today, reality check or for whatever, to effectively support their evidence, to support their answers, and to include a narrative. And the submission, once it's been board approved, will then go to Digby for an independent scoring process with independent professionals.
Just before going on to Ella, I just want to ask you one more question. How do you ensure, well, obviously the companies are putting their information onto the website according to your framework, but and I think you did explain it in your presentation, but I just want to be clear. The sort of independence, integrity aspect of the information that's being delivered there, how do you ensure that is in place?
I think that's a great question, because I think we're really trying to get to the truth of ESG, I suppose. That's the crux. So there's a number of different angles here. First of all, it's a questionnaire which has been really well thought through using all the different common initiatives already out there and making sure it's right-sized. It needs to be board approved. There needs to be evidence built into, so evidence needs to support, I wouldn't say every question, but many questions. And it's positive scoring structure. If you do supply the evidence, then there's a greater form of transparency and disclosure, which is exactly what ESG and where governments are trying to go to encourage corporates to do that. It then has to be board approved. So it has to be submitted by a board approved person. And then there is independent scoring who will look. It is not an algorithm driven scoring. It is a human driven score. There's only 2,000 odd public companies in the, although it's also available to privates, there are only 2,000 companies. So this is not an insurmountable task for us. So there's the independent scoring will effectively then look at the answers, look at the narrative, look at the evidence, and you'll be able to define whether or not the quality of that answer for that before the score is then published.
Great, thanks.
I should add,
that's
we would like to use our community. We'd like to use our community more as well to further enhance that as over time. But that's something for 21 or 22.
Okay, great, thank you. So now Ella Cullen is going to tell us about MindSpider, and now we're looking at responsible sourcing. This is an initiative for manufacturers, providing them with information on, and it uses blockchain technology. I'll hand over to Ella to explain more.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jane. So hi, everyone. I'm Ella Cullen. I'm co-founder and CMO of MindSpider. And MindSpider is an open blockchain protocol for supply chain due diligence. So we've seen a shift basically taking place in the market, and that's essentially from anonymous commodities to trusted products. And this shift is being enabled by greater transparency in our supply chains. So understanding where our raw materials are coming from and the conditions under which they're produced. Next slide, please. Wonderful. And I think if we're talking specifically about ESG, we understand that companies are increasingly expected to have a better understanding and better management of the exposure that they have to supply chain risks. And COVID-19 has really highlighted this. So we've seen a lot of companies have issues with business continuity and finding critical resources or critical inputs to their production. And beyond that, they have, increasing government pressure to bring their production closer to home. So they have these geopolitical issues as well. And as they're rethinking their supply chains, there's a greater focus on the E. So they want to minimize, for instance, their climate risk as they rethink how the global supply chains are going to look in the future. And I've snatched a quote here from the World Economic Forum, but I think it highlights that ultimately the most valuable information that we can get is across the entire supply chain, so end to end. But the question is, how do we actually capture this data? Next slide, please. And that's what we've been working on for the past 2 years at MindSpider. So what we've essentially created is a certificate system on top of a blockchain infrastructure. So every time you have a raw material shipment that you want to send downstream to an end manufacturer, we allow you to produce a digital certificate that is then tracked alongside this physical shipment. And we connect the two using a unique identifier, so usually something like a QR code. And this means that by the time it actually reaches the end manufacturer, you have a complete chain of custody. So they know the origins of their raw material, and they know exactly how it's been produced and the conditions under which it's been produced along every stage of the supply chain. Next slide, please. Wonderful. So we're running 2 large-scale projects at the moment. The first is for tin traceability. So we're tracking tin from a mine called San Rafael in Peru, which I think produces around 6% of the world's tin, to end manufacturers such as Google and Cisco. And we're also doing a project with Volkswagen where we track 2/3 of their global lead supply. And for that, we've tracked around 1,000 supply chain entities so far. Now, with both of these, the interesting part is that we're working very closely with the partners on what data to capture at every stage of the supply chain. So be that ESG reporting metrics, or be that compliance metrics, for instance, to comply with upcoming EU conflict minerals regulations. Next slide, please. And you may be wondering, how does blockchain help all of this? Well, once we have this data, obviously blockchain is a really interesting tool for storing it in an immutable fashion, which means it can't be changed. But also our particular blockchain protocol is built to be very flexible. So basically manufacturers can choose what kind of data they want to capture, and they can also push questionnaires out to each entity in their supply chain if they want to gather particular data for compliance, as I said before, or for reporting. Now, the data is also more secure because we're a decentralized protocol, so there is not a single gatekeeper or entity that has access or owns this data except for the manufacturer themselves. And we have a layered approach. So in the years that we've been working on this, we realized that there is an inherent trade-off between data privacy and data transparency in supply chains. And so we've created this 3-layer approach where essentially manufacturers can choose to keep some data private. We can choose to keep some data transparent so that the whole supply chain can see it. And we can also have some public so that we can verify the claims that they're making. And that, investors and so forth can ensure that the data is actually trusted that they're receiving. Wonderful. Next slide. So I think that was an incredibly rapid overview of what we do in 4 minutes. And I welcome all of your questions. Please feel free to shoot me an email. And I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Ella. So I know from your presentation that this is still developing. You've explained that you're in consultant with the parties that you're working with, and you're still developing the criteria that you're using in the supply chain, and that it can be flexible. I was also interested to see that you're not only looking at the product and the sort of credentials of the product, but you're looking at the conditions under which it's produced. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it has been an ongoing kind of, as you say, consultation with our product partners. And from this, we've actually just recently launched a new product called OreSource, which is specifically for mines and smelters and allows them to upload the due diligence data needed to comply with, for instance, the EU conflict mineral regulations. So if they're, importing into Europe from a developing nation or so forth, it ensures that they have all the correct information they need to actually sell to the European market. So it is an ongoing process, and we do, put a lot of effort into understanding people's data needs and also what they want to share with people and what is private information and competitive information that they don't need to share along the supply chain.
Great, thanks. I've got lots more questions for you, but I guess I need to keep moving again.
No worries.
Well, I'll ask them later, but we'll also give the audience a chance as well to put some questions forward. Thanks, Ella. So now Dr. Robert Pell from Minviro is going to tell you about Minviro's initiative. Now, it's my understanding that this is for mining companies, for mine planners. This tool should be particularly, it should be used in the early stages of planning, scoping of a project, pre-feasibility, feasibility, and it can go on to the operational phase. And I understand that not only will it help with mine design, but also help with the product environmental footprint ultimately. Rob, I'll let you take this further. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks for that intro, Jane. Yeah, so Minviro is a consultancy and technology company which provides lifecycle assessment solutions for the raw materials sector. So this is really focused on the E of the ESG, so really quantifying the environmental impacts. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that we use a lifecycle assessment technology. The audience may not have come across this as a concept, but it's basically a way to quantify the environmental performance, and it has its own ISO standards. So it's basically an approach where you can take into account all the material flows, including raw materials and energy, and all the direct emissions, and you can generate environmental impact scores for your product, whether it's coming out of your mine, your mineral processing facility, or refinery. And so basically you can get very detailed environmental performance scores. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, you basically, when you're carrying out a life cycle assessment, so this is what we do with our consultancy approaches. You sorry, next, I think we've just gone back one slide. Can we just go forward one more slide again? That's great, thanks. Yeah, so for the consultancy, we'd work with mining companies to calculate understand all the raw material inputs, and this is electricity and reagents and consumables and water, everything that you might have for your project, and understand all the emissions and everything. And then could you go on to the next slide, please? And basically, we've optimized this to be included in a software tool. Because life cycle assessment can really be used to quantify a range of environmental impacts throughout the project life. And one thing that we've noted, and we've been recognized by the European Commission, for integrating life cycle assessment in the design phase, which was what Jane was mentioning earlier. So although this graphic basically highlights that, the earlier on in a project you might have lower quality data, but you have a bigger opportunity to impact project decisions. So if a project hasn't decided whether they're going to use a particular processing route or whether they're going to use an electric mining fleet versus a conventional diesel fleet, this life cycle assessment tool can really get to the bottom and understand what kind of impact mitigation you're going to get from making those decisions. Next slide, please. Now, this next graphic might be a bit difficult for everybody to see, but the point of life cycle assessment, you may have heard of climate change. That's an impact category that's commonly referenced, but life cycle assessment is really trying to make sure that we don't offset one impact category into another. So if we're reducing climate change by 20-30%, let's make sure that we're not increasing water use or land use change or having impacts on human toxicity and stuff like this. So life cycle assessment can bring all those impact categories together and understand what kind of trade-offs you're making for your project. Okay, next slide, please. So again, this might be a little bit hard to see. Basically, we've created a software tool for mining engineers, anybody involved in a mining project to be able to use quickly and effectively to understand and quantify the environmental impact of their process. And we've used a bit of clever analysis in our software. So if you've got data gaps and you might not know certain parameters in your project, we can autofill that data from proxy projects, around the world. And the next slide, please. And so, yeah, we've a software tool which will be launched early 2021, which is looking just at the mining phase, but this is going to expand through the whole process and value chain. So will include refineries and even further downstream. So this is really looking to improve the environmental data that can be used in ESG to a much higher level of resolution. And something that's very important is this incorporates the scope 3 type emissions, so the impacts that you might have in your reagents that you consume. And this is something that's often missed at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. I want to check my understanding. So I explained that your tool would mainly be used by a mining company. Is that correct? Is it limited to the mining company, or would there be other users, other stakeholders wanting to look in and use that information?
Yeah, it's not just for the mining company. So, this software would be useful for investors, downstream users of the raw materials, to basically ensure that the raw materials that they're getting have a certain environmental performance credentials. So it's good for multiple stakeholders. Yeah. But the point is that this tool is primarily designed for use in the development stage of projects to really mitigate impacts, to understand hotspots in the production process and mitigate those impacts.
It isn't, I know that there's the ISO standard and I know things are going this way. To Rob. But how widely do you think mining companies are actually using life cycle assessment in their projects and project planning? Sorry, I'm still directing a question to Rob.
No, that's great. So it's being adopted really rapidly at the moment, and that is really getting the push from the end users, the OEMs of, say, the technology metals. So we're seeing demands from cathode manufacturers to understand the CO2 intensity of the raw material that they're using. Yeah, and so we've seen this a lot from consultancy, but we don't want mining companies to have to hire external consultants for carrying out these assessments. We want them to be able to do this process internally within normal project development.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.
I will just make sure that Xavier has a chance to give his presentation before we put forward any more questions. So Xavier Verdi is going to tell us about the Verdi label, which is a label specifically for environmental performance on mining projects. And I understand it's a certification scheme.
Okay, good afternoon. I would like to thank you, the Natural Resources Forum and Simmons to give us the opportunity to introduce Verde. So Verde, as Jane said, is a genuine environmental label for minerals responsible sourcing. In January in Davos, Tom Palmer, Newmont CEO, said, ESG is one of the issues that can rile up investors and miners. Slide 2, please. Slide 2, thank you. This declaration definitively comes from the pressure of the social society organizations, such as Amnesty International, Suicide, VVL for other NGOs and activists, unions, green political parties, parliament commissions, that advocates for better ESG performances. And the media, eventually, that expose some ESG poor performances in the mining sector. This pressure promotes initiatives from the UN, the EU, OECD, and so on. And as you know, for example, one of the most famous initiatives is the Kimberley process that came after Leonardo DiCaprio blockbuster Blood Diamond. Next slide, please. This exposure raised consumers and investors' awareness for ESG. Let's say finance business is born from there. Next slide. Please. Thank you. Then credibility needs certifications and labels. Today, there are LBMA, RGC, Climate Finance. There are a few credible certification and labels. However, their main concerns are social criteria and governance, but they barely address the environmental issues, even if they advocate generally for the SDG. Next slide. Responsible mining means preserve and restoration biodiversity. Biodiversity means healthy soils, clear water, fresh air, carbon offsets. To live in an healthy environment is a basic human right, or more simply, the people well-being. The E of the ESG, the mining sector can contribute to it. Mina Verde can assist mining companies and their clients to go on the green bonds or equity markets. Thank you for the video.
Thank you. I was quite interested to see that your scheme, you emphasize this point that the scheme is focused very much on the environmental dimension of ESG. But with it's quite difficult to separate environmental and social issues. I mean, environmental issues, you have highlighted that on one of your slides, can be linked to human rights. How do you do that with your certification scheme? How can you make that clear separation between the environmental and social issues?
But social issues in mining, particularly in mining industry, is addressed to the staff, to the suppliers, to the health and, let's say, health scheme, and the safety and security, because there's a hazardous environment. The environment, let's say, around the mining and after the mining operation, it's concerning the communities around, a little bit further, and the whole planet. So is where the human rights are really the point here, as it concerns the carbon emission, footprint emission, and biodiversity, which is the key of the life, and is where people need to have a, decent in a healthy world to live, and so that we can include it in the human rights, which is going to be a law, by the way, or I mean a regulation, enforce the regulation through the EU and ODC action soon.
Thanks, Xavier. We've got a question from the audience here that, and I am guessing that it was asked a little while ago. So I think the question is for Jamie. It's about the scoring. I think it's the scoring on the Digby. So the question is, how is the scoring any different from all other rating systems out there for companies, such as MSCI, DJCI, CDP, etc.? What is the added value of your scoring system?
Okay, thanks, Jane. I think the core of this is the questions are very much structured between a corporate questionnaire and then a project questionnaire, which is split into context and then action. And when it comes down to a project, which I think this question more relates to, is you need to understand the context of the project to start with, and then the impact of that, the impact of that context then relies on the actions by management in order to address or mitigate risk. So the difference in the scoring is very much based on the decisions by management based on the context of that project. In addition to that, which slightly kind of relates to the question as well, is this is not algorithm based. It is a human interrogation, so to speak. So it's very much looking at the whole questionnaire rather than just an algorithm kind of going over lots of different bits of it, like MSCI and Sustainalytics, etc. And also what we're trying to do is to also kind of come up with this balance sheet approach, which I know BlackRock have been very keen on for the mining industry, whereby some of the softer positives, which are so often the case with mining companies, also come out within a general score. So you can see not only the negatives, which always do come out, but maybe some of the softer positive things also have a more kind of balanced approach to a typical project. That's not to hide the negatives, but is to make sure that there's a more fair commentary on it. So the scoring system does basically evolves around context and as to where one fits with regards to a high-risk project, which might, for instance, be cobalt mining in DRC or a project in a national park, etc. You can then compare one project to another in a high-risk context, a medium-risk context, or effectively a low-risk context.
Thank you, Jamie. I'll have just one more question for you, Jamie. Is Ella covered the private information, public information issue, and I was just wondering with the Digby, obviously if a company is listed, there's information that their shareholders must have. I ask, the information that they're going to put on your platform, how would that link to the company website? Would a link be made, or would they just put the info? I'm trying to understand the value of being on your platform versus just putting the information out in the right format on their website. Sorry, that's not...
Oh, okay, so I think that kind of goes back to the questionnaire in the first place. The whole point of what we're trying to do is to get to the truth of ESG at the end of the day, to create an opportunity for management to manage their risks in a better way, and for investors or other stakeholders to be able to compare one company or one project against others in the same sort of context. So the questions are written when we go live later this December. You'll be able to see them, but the questions are written in a different way. They're not siloed into E, S, and G. G clearly is a little bit more on its own than the E and the S, but there are so many questions which cover E and S and go over each other. So the questions, and if you take a pre-PFS company at the moment, we're at about 65 questions. So to answer that question is, the company is providing the information so it becomes a public source of information. The drive in ESG is very much for transparency and disclosure, so it's up to the company as to what sort of evidence they want to provide with regards to the supporting of that answer. And it is very much available for private companies as much as it is for public companies. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. There's another question for you, and that is, will the score develop be quantitative entirely? How transparent will the scoring be for the companies?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the scoring structure, so will be done independently. There will be very clear guidance as to how the score is done. It will initially be done by the affiliates of Satala, but that will ultimately lead to using our expert network, which we will open up at the moment, currently consisting of geologists, metallurgists, engineers. With regards to our other product, which is the research side, we'll open that up to more ESG professional type people, and they will be approved, or certain groups will be approved to score the thing on a system devised by Satara initially. And clearly, with regards to ESG, it's not all black and white, so therefore it will be very clearly, you need to answer the question as provided. Some of them will be multi-choice, some of them will be straightforward yes or no questions, but there is always a narrative capability and then the supporting of the evidence. So it is substantiated by that basis.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question of John. Again, go back to John and the virtual site visit. John, when I was trained originally, many years ago, nearly 3 decades ago, working in the mining industry, I was told a site visit is like 1 million maps. And obviously technology has changed, and you're showing that you can have a virtual site visit. Now, you did mention in your presentation that you could present the setting. And for me, that was very interesting, because I think the context of each operation is unique. The mining project and the way it interacts with its unique setting is terribly important. Jamie also made that point. And I think it's important for mining companies to communicate their understanding of that setting and how they're interacting with it. So would you like to comment a little bit more on how your tool helps them to do that?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the question. What we've done with Reality Check is, as I say, create a sort of a tool set for the industry to leverage. The best actors in the space will already be gathering the kind of data and information required to, in effect, state their case as to why their project is of a benefit not just to their shareholders, but to the communities and to sort of humanity as a whole, I suppose. And what the industry's not been so good at historically is showcasing that information to their broader set of stakeholders. So what we've done is we've created a very convenient way for the mining industry to show that they've done their homework. So the kind of maps and sort of local situational intelligence that you would want to see if you were doing an ESG audit on the project, they can very easily put into our platform so it can be seen there and in a very digestible context. So if you take, for example, our contoured satellite images, they show the relief of the surrounding ground, which can be important for things. If it's a proposed project, it can be important for things such as potential tailings management strategies. Also seeing where local communities sit in regards to where the proposed or existing site is operating. You can see all of that from those satellite images. But you can also take things like data augmented maps, which mining companies are already producing with industry standard products like Esri, and putting them into our platform so that you can engage with a much broader audience of stakeholders using the work that you have already done. So, we're very, pleased, and we think it's very important, the fact that we are not generating any significant extra work for mining companies. There is an element of additional data gathering, that is true, but for the most part, this is information that the mining companies already have and just haven't historically known how to leverage to optimize value from that work that they've already done. So absolutely, situational intelligence from maps, from satellite images, from 3D models, and from any data that's being collected, as well as that 360-degree element, provide that granular detail of a site. Because as much as the ESG world is looking for standardization of metrics, so we can all compare like with like, as anyone who has been in the mining industry for a long time knows, every single mine site is unique. Every single mine site has its own nuances and specific pressures that a mine site traditionally has been the only way really to uncover. And what we're doing is helping mining companies show the world that they've done their homework. They know the obstacles that they have ahead of them, and therefore it's fair to give them or believe that they have the strategies in place to deal with those obstacles and manage those pressures locally as any responsible corporate citizen should.
That's great. I do think it's incredibly important to show that you understand those local communities, where they are relative to the mine infrastructure, show you understand the surrounding habitats and how sensitive they are, show you understand the drainage and water use in the surrounding community. So that's very interesting that you are looking to present that with a virtual site visit.
Thank you. Just as an anecdote in that regard, one comment we had from a user, there's a project that's situated in a hillside, but quite close to a large populated area. And it was possible to very quickly see that the hill was completely sheltering the local population from the project. That would be very difficult to see and understand from a two-dimensional drawing, especially for non-specialists, whereas seeing it in our environment, as an example, it was very quickly apparent that the impacts on the local community would be very minimal because of the noise shelter, the dust shelter, the drainage direction, all of those things that you just mentioned.
I just, coming to Ella next, I know, Jamie has already explained to me that the information that Reality Check Systems are generating, a sort of virtual site visit, that information could go onto the DigB, that could be used on the platform. I'm interested to know, Ella, in your Mine Spider initiative, would you use this kind of information where you were looking at the conditions on a site at all? Or is this
Sure.
not something that you're in?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think we're quite data agnostic, so we allow companies to upload whatever certified data they deem to be interesting to communicate down the supply chain. So no, that sounds like a very valuable tool, and of course we can integrate that kind of system as a third party into the MindSpider blockchain.
And I'm going to come to Rob now. Rob, so many people are struggling with scope 3 emissions, and you seem so comfortable using it with your life cycle assessment package. And I'd like you, well, your tool, and I'd like you to elaborate a little bit on why you think it's easy and how mines can do it easily.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'll just clear up in terms of there's a difference between corporate reporting and product-oriented reporting. Most of our consultancy work, we're trying to generate an environmental value for a product leaving a facility, whether that's a kilogram of lithium, carbonate or lithium hydroxide or whatever. So when we're talking about scope 3 emissions, we're really considering all the embodied impacts associated with, say, lime production, which is going to be used in the processing. And this is something that is really, really important for a lot of the technology metals. I mean, for lithium production, it can contribute, upwards of 30, 40% of the total CO2 or climate change impact. And we're seeing a lot of the time that this is being completely ignored because it's too challenging, or there's an assumption that the data availability isn't good enough. But what we do within Enviro, we're not just creating this software tool, we're actually working really hard behind the scenes to improve the data quality of all those raw materials that are used in this process as well. So and what we would encourage is just because it's challenging, it shouldn't be ignored, because at the end of the day, we're trying to solve sustainability challenges, and scope 3 emissions is one of those sustainability challenges.
So, and I'm going to push you a little bit further on the scope 3 emissions. So how does your tool, the Enviro tool, make it easier for mining companies to explore their scope 3 emissions and define them? Okay,
so the user experience allows you to select, say when I'm talking scope 3 emissions, I'm talking about the embodied impacts of the reagents, not the downstream use of that, that metal in say if it's used it's basically, we're measuring the impact up to the gate. And so the way that we've basically got a very large database, which we've compiled from other databases out there, but also we've done a lot of work creating our own. So a user would say, okay, we're consuming lime in this process, or we're consuming diesel in this process and electricity in this process. We've got some clever models which enables, say, for example, if you've put your latitude and longitude in for your project, and then you say, I'm consuming this much electricity, it'll automatically connect to that regionally specific data for the CO2 intensity per kilowatt hour of electricity. But it's also the same with the reagents that would be consumed. Say at a mine site, also like at a mine site, you might be using explosives. But, it's very important to get the type of explosives right and making sure that you understand how that explosives has got to site and everything. So we've done a lot of work on making sure that can connect up very easily and simply.
Great. Thank you. And I'm going to go back to Xavier now with a question. Xavier, I was interested to know, I do agree with you that biodiversity is something that really does get neglected with reporting and disclosure. And I understand that your certification scheme that's one of the things that you're looking at and focusing on. I was interested to know what standards you might use, whether you're using the IFC performance standards at all?
We work closely with local or regional scientific institutes, Forestry Institute, the Biology Institute, because in each part of this world, there is a difference of regulation, difference of perception, and of course, difference of biodiversity. I give you two short examples. When we work in French Guyana, which is the EU department, and the law asks the miners, the mining companies or mining operation when they close, to rehabilitate and reforest 30%, 1/3 of the site. When we had an auditor from Canada, he asked us why we don't burn the trees that have been felled, to improve the fertility of the soils for the reforestation. First of all, a discussion about the carbon emission, but is forbidden by law. When we had work in a Yukon mine, and we had here it was the reverse. We can burn the trees and to accelerate the fertility of the soils, which is, in point of view of our expert in Europe, is not good for the biodiversity. So really, we insist that we work with this local institute, with universities and research institute. They set up the standards as per at least the rules and the laws of the country where the mine is located. The standards cannot be worldwide, is what I mean.
Okay, so you're not specifically working to the IFC performance standard, is the answer?
No, we got inspiration for it, but we think that some are not adjusted or some are not enough. I mean, but not adjusted to all situations. Particularly for the biodiversity, a frog in Canada is not the same as a frog in Peru or in Congo. If you allow me this comparison.
Our time is nearly up. We've only got 2 minutes left. So I would like to ask any of the panelists whether there is something that they would like to say before we close off. Invite you all, if you have a burning point you would like to make, I'll stand back and let you make it.
Well, Jane, I'd just like to say, number one, thank you so much for chairing this session. Number two, I would urge the mining industry and the extractive industries more broadly to be brave and, to be on the front foot, be transparent and show the world what you're doing because, there are people in developed countries that have no idea what goes on at a mine site. They don't know the problems that are faced. They do not know the challenges that are faced. And so they can't begin to put their shoulder to the wheel to help figure out the solutions that the industry faces. Well, if we can harness the talent, insights, intelligence, and abilities of all of those people by being clearer with them what we are doing, then I'm sure we will move a lot further, a lot faster. And so, all of us here on the panel have come up with great solutions to help the mining industry do that. Embrace us, bring us into the ecosystem. We've made it easy for you, and let's get on the front foot and make sure that it's an industry that we can all be proud to work for.
John, I would second that. And it really goes back to what I was saying right at the beginning. There is a single opportunity that we've had, probably the best opportunity in a generation, for this industry really to show what the good that we can do, as well as improve many of the habits that we've had in the past and improve on that. So I would second what you said, and I'd also like to thank Jane and also the conference organisers, Simmons and Simmons, as well as National Resources Forum for hosting this. I think an outstanding opportunity. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Well, I can't do better rounding off, so I will close off here. Thank you, everybody. Eamon, do you want to close off as well?
Thank you so much, Jane, and thank you to all our speakers for joining us today. We know how busy your schedules are, so thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. On behalf of all of our sponsors, we look forward to welcome you back to the next panel discussion. If you would like to register for any of the remaining ESG Week webinars, please go to our website, naturalresourcesforum.com, to view the agenda and to register. Today's webinar has, of course, been recorded, so please do look out for the link of the playback, which will be posted on our website. And Maitland have kindly taken notes for us today, and will be producing a summary note on today's discussion, which will as well be available to download. So thank you again to all, and we look forward to seeing you soon, tomorrow. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.